Hey, so it's been almost, actually a little over 2 years since Eddie Van Halen passed away. And a little bit after that happened, I talked to a local radio station and I said, Van Halen's the closest thing we've had to the Beatles since the Beatles. And he didn't really believe me, but I'm going to give my arguments for that. So I've got about 10 reasons why I think Van Halen was the Beatles of the 80s, at least what the Beatles were to the 60s. So, um, the Beatles are the greatest band in history, and I mean that both like as they were probably the best and the greatest, and that's probably a theme for a different video because sometimes there's a difference between the best and the greatest. Like, were you technically the best, um, but maybe not the greatest because maybe somebody else had more influence than you. So that's another topic for another time. But I think the Beatles were probably both, and so not only did they really write really good songs and they took risks and they changed music, and not just in the 60s. They not just changed rock and roll and pop music, but all music forever was changed. And so you're thinking, could there ever be another Beatles? So a lot of people are thinking, well, the Monkees or the Dave Clark Five or the Who were kind of the next Beatles. But so the Dave Clark Five and the Monkees were kind of like imitations, and the Who were really just the first Who instead of the next Beatles. That's how I look at it. And both the Who was just a really neat band too. Could make another video just about them. But this is about Van Halen. So I mean, there's some other bands that were kind of like that, like maybe Queen or David Bowie, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, and I think those are all great bands. But I don't think they really changed the direction of music like the Beatles did, or like Van Halen did. So that's why I'm staying with my pick. I'd say that the closest thing to the Beatles after the Beatles was Van Halen. So we're gonna go over a little more of those reasons. So reason number 10. Oh, I was supposed to play this music in the background. Okay, so interesting fact, both groups kind of failed their first auditions. The Beatles were trying to get signed by Decca, and Decca said, no, guitar groups are on their way out, we're not going to sign you. They eventually signed the Rolling Stones instead. And the Beatles Van Halen did an album for Kiss's Gene Simmons, and they ended up not getting signed. And so there was kind of a lost opportunity there for Gene Simmons. So I think the message there is, just because you fail doesn't mean you won't be the greatest ever. Just keep trying again. Reason number 9. Super weird fact. They both couldn't read music when they first got signed. They were becoming world famous, and they didn't really have the ability to read music. John and Paul weren't really classically trained. They just kind of learned on their own. And even though Eddie was trained on the piano, he just didn't learn the music. He just kind of played by ear. And he even won a competition playing a piano piece where the reason they really liked him was he did his own interpretation. He thought, well, I thought I was just playing it the right way. He didn't realize he was doing, basically improvising and putting his own spin on it. So reason number 8, in case you're wondering, I wrote my notes in VIM, open source. So, this is a cool thing. Both bands really paid tribute to rock and roll's African American roots. The Beatles really liked Little Richard and Chuck Berry, and they also covered some R&B songs like "You Really Got a Hold on Me," and that was just by Smokey Robinson, and "Baby It's You" by the Shirelles. Then Van Halen covered "Ice Cream Man" by John Brim, which is I think came out in the 40s, and "You're No Good," which was first recorded by Dee Dee Warwick. Both bands would credit R&B and blues artists whenever in a lot of the interviews, so they really recognize that that's where rock and roll came from. Number 7, fans were devastated by the breakup. So the Beatles broke up in 1970 after releasing Let It Be, they kind of had broken up, sort of even in that process of that album, and it was a shock for everybody. It just was like the world had changed. There's something that's never going to be again. And then when Van Halen broke up, when Dave left the band and went solo, I think that was almost the same feeling for people who grew up in the '80s. Just an end to the era. Number 6, music videos. So in the '60s, they didn't call them music videos; they called them like promo videos. But the Beatles did a lot of use on that, especially like "Strawberry Fields" and "Hello Goodbye." And Van Halen pretty much created the MTV music video. They probably weren't the first video, but they really helped cement the music video as part of culture. Okay, I remember number 5 already. East meets West, or Europe. So the Beatles were born in England, and at some point they started taking influences from Indian music and some Japanese culture, especially when John married Yoko. And then you had Eddie and Alex, who were actually born in Europe. They're born in the Netherlands. Their dad was Dutch, and they had Asian influence growing up because their mom was from Indonesia. And a funny thing, David Lee Roth really got into some of the Japanese culture, doing martial arts, and he speaks a good amount of Japanese. You'll hear that on the live album that they produced live at the Tokyo Dome. Really neat to hear him speaking Japanese. Oh, and also, the Beatles started incorporating Indian instruments into their music. So, like Norwegian Wood and Tomorrow Never Knows, and what's the other one? And With and Without You and some other songs too. And Van Halen also used a sitar in Ain't Talking About Love. They used like an electrical sitar. So unfortunately, number 4, untimely passing. So that's kind of why I'm doing the video now, because it's about the 2-year anniversary since Eddie Van Halen died. And so both groups suffered losses. John Lennon died at the age of 40. George Harrison died at 58 from lung cancer, and Eddie Van Halen died at age 65 also from lung cancer. So something we wish they didn't have in common, but that's kind of a strange thing that is a parallel in both stories of both bands. Number 3, polarizing rivalry was their strength and weakness. So both bands had these 2 members who were really kind of the driving creative force. So you had John and Paul. They're always trying to outdo each other. They're always trying to play off of each other. John would write Help, and Paul would write, The Night Before. You'd have Strawberry Fields by John, and then Paul would write Penny Lane. You'd have each one was trying to outdo the other, trying to write some really neat songs. And you had that kind of also the different personalities in David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen, constantly, very passionate, wanting to take the bands in 2 different directions. So even though that caused them to break up, it probably also caused them to be great at the same time. So it's kind of weird that was both their strength and kind of their undoing in the end. Number 2, the music. So this could be just a top 10 list by itself. Just how they were great artists. So you've got probably the best of their era. And if you were on a desert island, a lot of people say, if I was going to desert island, I can only take one artist. So I would take the Beatles. And so that would be a tough choice. I'd probably either choose the Beatles or Van Halen. And so you got to think about how great these songs were. So let's talk about the Beatles. So the Beatles had some really, really out-of-the-box songs where they just blew people away. So you have songs like Strawberry Fields, Full on the Hill, Hey Jude. Van Halen had some really different songs like Could This Be Magic, Little Guitars, Girl Gone Bad. Those aren't even some of the most popular songs. Those are some of my favorite deep cuts from their albums. Just really good songwriting. Harmonies. that they had in their music. Just listen to when they do like 3-part harmonies, or they'll do some layering. Both bands did some really neat stuff with, the Beatles had Because and This Boy and It's True. I think that was another song. And if you listen to like even just Van Halen's I'm the One, there's some really great harmonies in there. But just like the songwriting is just really neat, just how they would just kind of take a song in different directions than you thought it would be. They were fun songs, but they also were, I think you'd very well say that these are some very sophisticated songs. Oh man, almost 10 minutes over. Okay, number one. So just remember this point, music would never be the same, and everybody wanted to copy these guys. So the influence, that's what really made Van Halen the Beatles of the 80s. The Beatles changed music forever. It was a revolution and an evolution. Guitar bands were supposed to be on the way out, and the Beatles come back, or the Beatles come in and just, hey, rock and roll's back. They go on the Ed Sullivan Show, girls are going crazy, and everybody wants to copy them. And this is after Elvis was in the Army. Bobby Darin was kind of like the teen heartthrob, and in 1959, you had that terrible plane crash that was deemed the day the music died. And the Beatles just kind of like changed the whole direction of the way the music industry was going. Then with Van Halen, they came, even though I was saying they influenced the 80s, they first got signed in the 70s, so in 78 was their debut album. So what were they up against? They were also supposed to be, heavy metal and hard rock bands were supposed to be on the way out. There was kind of like soft rock. There was disco. There was, soul was always popular, but those were the bands. Andrew Lloyd Webber had just put out Evita. And then along came the Mighty Van Halen. People heard the song Eruption, and it's like, wait a minute, what is that? People didn't know if that was a guitar, if that was a piano, if that was sound effects. And so it was just like the Beatles were changing music using different instruments, using layering, using different sound. Eddie did that just like with his guitar. David Lee Roth did it with basically just his personality. And everybody wanted to be, all guitar players then wanted to be Eddie Van Halen. All lead singers wanted to be David Lee Roth. The Beatles came along in the 60s. All of a sudden you have like the Rolling Stones, Herman's Hermits, the Monkees, Dave Clark 5, and eventually the Who, the Byrds, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, all super influenced by the Beatles. And then like in the 80s, you have Van Halen, and then all of a sudden all these other rock bands want to play like, heavy metal, but it's metal that you can dance to. It's party music. So you got like Motley Crue, Poison, Skid Row, Cinderella, Metallica. And Metallica was kind of different. And eventually, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, the Foo Fighters, Warrant, and Rat, all these bands really were just able to perform and take influence from David Lee Roth. And they all weren't copycats. A lot of them were able to keep expanding, and the evolution kept going. And that was only because Van Halen was like, hey, this is who we are. We're going to bring back rock and roll. And they changed heavy metal and hard rock. And that was what carried the 80s. There was like 10 new bands every year in the 80s. So that's why I say Van Halen was the Beatles of the 80s. So comment below if you disagree. Maybe you think somebody else was the closest thing to the Beatles, and you're probably going to say Oasis. But I'm going to say they didn't change rock and roll like Van Halen did. Just didn't have the influence. So tell me what you think. If you like the video, like it. Hopefully subscribe. And, check out some of my other videos, especially some of my singing of Van Halen and Poison and Motley Crue. I'll try to add some new videos too. Got some ideas. So take care, and hey, let's remember Eddie, John, and George Harrison, and celebrate David Lee Roth, who's still with us, and Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, as well as Alex and Wolfgang and, heck, even Sammy Hagar, and of course Michael Anthony. All right.